Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Mathews lecture in Byzantine Christianity. This is the fifth of a relatively new lecture series. It was established in 2021. It was established through the kind donation in the name of the Reverend Constantine Mathews. This is the Endowment for Excellence in Byzantine Christianity. It is especially meaningful to give to host the lecture this year because we received word not long ago that Reverend Constantine died about a month ago. So we're very grateful for the generosity that he has shown to the Medieval Institute, and we extend our gratitude to his family who hopefully are watching online. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce the introducer. So please welcome the Archbishop Demetrios Chair in Byzantine Theology here at Notre Dame, Reverend Dr. Alexis Torrance.
Thank you, Jeff. And before introducing our illustrious speaker, I would like to echo the sentiments of Professor Wicks in offering my sincere condolences to Vasilius and Nikiforos Mathews on the repose of their father, the Reverend Constantine or Costa Mathews, after whom the lecture series is named. We're exceedingly grateful for the opportunity to continue Father Costa's legacy here at Notre Dame in our own modest way. May the memory of the much beloved priest Constantine Mathews be eternal. Eonia sui mnimi, axio makariste, kaimniste adelpheimon. And now to our speaker. How fittingly has Providence arranged that this year's speaker be an expert in Byzantine mnemosina, roughly equivalent to the Latin memoria, and encompassing the various medieval Greek practices and customs linked with the commemoration of the deceased. Professor Zachary Chitwood is the relatively newly minted incumbent of the most ancient chair, Lehrstuhl, of Byzantine studies in the world, which is at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität of Munich. But he began his academic journey nearby at Ripon College in Wisconsin before moving to Princeton for graduate work. There, Professor Chitwood completed his doctorate in 2012 on Middle Byzantine legal culture under the famed Byzantinist John Haldon. And his thesis was revised and later published as a monograph with Cambridge University Press. Ever since, he's been based in Germany, first at the Humboldt University of Berlin, followed by the Johannes Gutenberg University of Mainz, and now at the University of Munich. He has so far won 2 coveted European Research Council grants to conduct his research, each for eye-watering amounts. The first grant was to explore Mount Athos in medieval Eastern Mediterranean society, about $1.75 million awarded in 2019, and the second to examine the challenge of Islam and the transformation of Eastern Christian normative regimes, circa 630 to 1100, about $2.3 million awarded in 2024. Well, at least we know that government support for the humanities isn't dead everywhere. Thank God, and thanks to the efforts of Professor Chitwood, this also extends to Byzantine studies. Unsurprisingly, Professor Chitwood's impressive array of publications and digital humanities projects tackle many different aspects of these project themes, but rather than list them, without further ado, let me hand things over to our esteemed speaker, nestled somewhere in the middle here, so that I, together with you, can learn new insights about Byzantine prayer for the dead at this, our 5th annual Mathews Lecture. Welcome, Professor Chitwood.
So, first of all, let me thank Thank you for that very kind introduction. That's the first time I've ever been called illustrious and esteemed. I hope to live up to these lofty expectations. I won't be winning any million-dollar grants here, but I think I do have a very relevant topic for this evening about the invention of prayer for the dead in the Byzantine tradition. So without further ado, I will begin my talk. Let me just make sure that my slides are working. Okay, so the impetus for the topic of my talk this evening began with a paradox. Several years ago, I began examining lists of commemoration, the names of the deceased that were to be read out during the liturgy, stemming from monasteries on Mount Athos. Although I was interested above all in commemorative lists from the medieval period, I quickly ascertained that almost all such lists in Greek stem from the post-medieval epoch, such as the one you can see on this slide. This is a very late example from 1803, but those of you who can read Greek, you might be able to make out some of the words here. Sorry, one second. Yeah. Trying to use my laser pointer here. Oh, I can also just point, I suppose. Gravion, which is a common designation for these sorts of books. Ton Titoron, so of the founders. And then you have the names Nicephorus, Johannes, the emperors, and Athanasius the monk. So these are two 10th century Byzantine emperors and Athanasius of Athos. And the state of affairs about the relatively late date of commemorative lists on Mount Athos didn't apply only to lists in Greek, but also to lists written in Church Slavonic. And this is a very early example from Hilendar Monastery that was probably written around the year 1500. And in fact, one of the surprising twists and turns in the story of Byzantine memoria or commemoration is that the earliest and most informative source for Athenite commemoration that we possess is actually written in Georgian. And indeed at Aviron Monastery, the monastery of the Georgians on Mount Athos. And it was written in the year 1074 before being amended in the early 12th century. And this is the so-called Book of Commemorations, or Agapes, which I will return to again later in this talk. So since the first major Athenite communal monasteries appeared in the second half of the 10th century, it was perhaps not so surprising that commemorative lists from the archives of the Holy Mountain's great monasteries were likewise sparse before the late Middle Ages and early modern period. Nonetheless, the more I sought to contextualize the history of these commemorative texts, the more I realized that there is, in fact, almost no research and at first glance very little evidence for Byzantine commemoration before the year 1000. Why? Is this a result of happenstance? Or, more intriguingly, is the answer to this question more complex? Was the commemoration of the dead through prayer and almsgiving always an unquestioned feature of the Byzantine tradition? Or does the Athenite evidence in fact reflect the gradual emergence of a new memorial praxis? It is the question of the origins and establishment of the Byzantine commemorative tradition, especially over the long late antiquity, from roughly 300 to 1000 AD, that I will explore in my talk tonight. Let us start, however, with a basic question. What do I mean by prayer for the dead in the Byzantine context? In fact, prayer for the dead is a shorthand for the religious commemoration of the dead more generally, an idea often subsumed within the Latin term memoria. For the Western Middle Ages, the late Giles Constable has offered us the following definition. Quote, memoria meant much more than memory or recollection in the modern sense. It was used for the remains of the dead and the places where they were buried, as well as for acts performed in their honor. Offerings or prayers made for, pro, or on behalf of dead persons invoke their presence, as Christ was present at the celebration of the Eucharist. Memoria linked the eternal and the temporal, and brought the past into the present. It thus created community, communication, and participation, both among the living and with the dead. The close relationship between the living and the deceased was memorably described by the German medievalist Otto Gerhard Oechsler as die Gegenwart der Toten, the presence of the dead, by which he argued that the physical demise of a person in the pre-modern period did not coincide with their social death. Quite on the contrary, their dead were thought to share the same space as their living counterparts. Evidence for this ranges from the arguments of intellectuals like Sir Thomas More, who suppose that the morals of the living were subjected to the watchful censure of the deceased, to the more prosaic encounters of most people with the dead in the form of the churchyard or the Kirchhof. Before cemeteries were physically separated from the spaces of the living for hygienic reasons over the course of the Enlightenment, the graves of the deceased were usually to be found directly in the vicinity of the church. This physical proximity of the living and dead, according to Oxley, symbolized the shared society which they both inhabited. It is within the remit of medieval studies that the pioneering research on memoria was first conducted. And even though there are studies of memoria in such related disciplines like Islamic studies and Slavic studies, this specialist subfield has never completely lost its Western tinge. A quick perusal of recent publications on memoria confirms that studies on the commemoration of the dead are focused overwhelmingly on Western and Central Europe in the Middle Ages and early modern period. As far as Byzantine studies are concerned, from a philological perspective, there is no Greek word that has quite the same resonance as the Latin memoria. The most common term, as we just heard, is mnemosina. That said, the terminology for commemorative prayer in Greek is in general less fixed than the more studied memorial tradition of the Latin Middle Ages. By focusing in my lecture on the Byzantine tradition of prayer for the dead, I would like to highlight two differences between the way Byzantine memoria differed from its counterpart in the Latin West. First, the idea that prayer and benefactions on behalf of the dead was basically a good thing, and that furthermore they could improve the state of the deceased post-mortem was never seriously called into question in the Latin West, outside of some heretical movements until the Reformation. There were, of course, some individual components of the medieval memorial tradition which did attract censure, such as the commemorative feast, which was criticized as early as the time of Augustine. Yet, as we shall see, this notion of the commemoration of the deceased as an unmitigated positive developed rather differently, and so I will argue, much later in Byzantium. Beginning in late antiquity and into the 11th and 12th century, we can discern a more or less continuous vein of critique, which saw the commemoration of the deceased as, at best, vainglory and at worst, spiritually harmful. Second, even after the intensive commemoration of the deceased was widely accepted in Byzantium as able to better the state of the departed from the 11th century onward, it remained a much more fluid and less fixed tradition than its Western counterpart. Its relatively inchoate character reflected the more general reticence of Byzantine theology to exhaustively describe the afterlife, as demonstrated several years ago, for instance, in this monograph of Vasilis Marinas, Death and the Afterlife in Byzantium. Thus, ideas such as purgatory and the precise numbers of masses that might lessen a believer's time there would have been foreign to Byzantine memorial practice. True, there was a general sense of a space in between heaven and hell after death, as well as the notion that prayers, alms, and fasting might better the post-mortal fate of the deceased, but neither concept was precisely delineated by Orthodox thinkers, Byzantine thinkers, until, let's say, very late in the Middle Ages. So, moving on now to the origins of Byzantine memoria, from the primitive church to the end of late antiquity, we can identify two major influences on the Christian practice of commemoration. The first was that of Greco-Roman culture, which certainly did have some elements of memorial practice that would later play a role in the Byzantine development of memoria, such as commemorative feasts in honor of the deceased and annual memorial rites performed at tombs. That said, it must be emphasized that these pagan memorial practices were representative of what some researchers have termed secular memoria, namely commemorative practices that were focused on the perpetuation of the name, fame, and memory of the deceased, rather than religious or liturgical memoria, memorial acts that aimed at somehow improving the post-mortal fate of the deceased in the hereafter. The latter, as argued by some scholars, are first discernible in the Eastern Mediterranean with monotheistic religions. The initial reluctance in the Byzantine tradition to unreservedly support the commemoration of the deceased stemmed at least in part from the lack of biblical precedents for prayer for the dead. The passage in Scripture which most emphatically demonstrates that the fate of the deceased could still be ameliorated by the living, even after their demise, occurs in 2 Maccabees 12:38-45. And since this is a very important passage that will be cited a lot by Byzantine thinkers and will occur a few times in this presentation, I will take the liberty of reading it out loud here. Quote, "Then Judas assembled his army and went to the city of Abdullam. As the seventh day was coming on, they purified themselves according to the custom and kept the Sabbath there. On the next day, as had now become necessary, Judas and his men went to take up the bodies of the fallen and to bring them back to lie with their kindred in the sepulchres of their ancestors. Then, under the tunic of each one of the dead, they found sacred tokens of the idols of Gemnia, which the law forbids the Jews to wear. And it became clear to all that this was the reason these men had fallen. So they all blessed the ways of the Lord, the righteous judge, who reveals the things that are hidden. And they turned to supplication, praying that the sin that had been committed might be wholly blotted out. The noble Judas exhorted the people to keep themselves free from sin, for they had seen with their own eyes what had happened as a result of the sin of those who had fallen. He also took up a collection, man by man, to the amount of 2,000 drachmas of silver, and sent it to Jerusalem to provide for a sin offering. In doing this, he acted very well and honorably, taking account of the resurrection. For if he were not expecting that those who had fallen would rise again, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead. But if he was looking to the splendid reward that is laid up for those who fall asleep in godliness, it was a holy and pious thought. Therefore he made atonement for the dead, so that they might be delivered from their sin. And just to contextualize this passage a little bit, this occurs after a major battle in the book of Maccabees, and there are a lot of Israelite fallen, and upon gathering up these corpses for burial, they find tokens of an idol, of a foreign god, which of course is a major issue in Judaism. And so Judas, this Maccabee general, collects a sort of an offering on behalf of these fallen soldiers. So, not surprisingly, in later centuries, proponents of commemorative prayer and alms were much given to citing this passage. Beyond this biblical testimony, there is only sparse evidence in early Christianity for the commemoration of the deceased. The earliest attestation for the commemorations of the dead in Byzantine civil or canon law, for instance, stems from the so-called apostolic constitutions. These prescriptions were ascribed to Pope Clement I, but were probably drawn up around the year 380 and likely reflect the primitive practices of the Antiochene Church. And in a section of the 8th book, which is concerned with funerary practice, it is stated, quote, let the third day of the deceased be celebrated with psalms and prayers because of the one who rose after 3 days, and on the 9th in the memory of the living and dead, and on the 40th according to the old usage. For the people thus also lamented Moses on the anniversary day in his memory, and let distributions to the poor be made in his memory. So distributions to the needy on behalf of the deceased, which were not a feature, by the way, of pagan memorial practice, appear already to have been a fixed component of early Christian commemorations. These days of commemoration after death were thought to represent stages in the soul's gradual departure of the body, by the way. So, though annual commemorations celebrated on the day of death are actually not mentioned in the apostolic constitutions, they might have become anchored within the Christian tradition shortly thereafter, for they are mentioned in the legislation of Justinian. In the 133rd novel of that emperor, which regulates monastic life, it is stated in a section on the strict separation of the sexes in their own monasteries and convents that members of the opposite sex are not even allowed to attend the commemorative services of a deceased monk or nun. In addition to services on the 3rd, 9th, and 40th days after death, annual commemoration is also mentioned. So here in the 6th century, we already see basically the calendar of commemorations that we know from present Orthodox practice. So 3rd, 9th, and 40th days after death, and annual commemorations. So commemoration and prayer for the dead are not discussed at any great length in the writings of the most important Greek church fathers of the 4th and 5th centuries, such as the Cappadocian Fathers and John Chrysostom. It has been noted by Gerhard Oechsle that, unlike the most important Latin fathers of the same period, such as Augustine, the Greek fathers were considerably more restrained in their critique of pagan memorial practices, including the memorial meal, and indeed of what has sometimes been termed ancestor worship, more generally. Rather than directly attacking elaborate funerary or commemorative practices, the Cappadocian Fathers and John Chrysostom instead focused on the hope of Christians for a second life after death, for the resurrection. Focused criticism of such memorial practices was rather exceptional. For example, Gregory of Nazianzus, in his funeral oration for Basil of Caesarea, describes the offering of libations, first fruits, and flowers to the dead as the reflexes of custom immemorial and unreasoning grief. Yet he makes his observation in a highly rhetorical context, namely as a contrast to his own funerary offering to Basil, the gift of words. It is, moreover, merely a passing comment within the oration as a whole, and cannot be construed as a sustained critique of commemorative praxis in a manner comparable to that of Augustine. Let's now turn to John Chrysostom. So in the context of championing his well-known emphasis on the practice of Christian charity, this Greek church father also briefly discussed memorial praxis. In his homilies on the Acts of the Apostles, for instance, he exhorted his congregation to desist from erecting funerary monuments or taking care for commemorations, which is a clear reference to the traditional form of pagan remembrance still practiced in his day, and to redirect one's memorial efforts toward the relief of widows. And this is the citation on the folio here, on the slide. Quote, "Let us not busy ourselves about monuments nor about memorials. This is the greatest memorial. Set widows to stand around him. Tell them his name. Bid them all make for him their prayers, their supplications. This will overcome God. Though it has not been done by the man himself, yet because of him, another is the author of the almsgiving. Even this pertains to the mercy of God. Widows standing around and weeping know how to rescue, not indeed from the present death, but from that which is to come. Many have profited even by the alms done by others on their behalf. For even if they have not attained perfect deliverance, at least they have found some comfort thence." Chrysostom's description of the memorial attained by giving charity to widows is, for late antiquity, actually highly exceptional, because it describes a form of memoria practically unknown at that time, and which foreshadowed later medieval forms. In place of the general commemoration of the Christian dead normally discussed in late antiquity, Chrysostom here describes a very specific form of individual commemoration, in which the benefactor commissioned a group of widows to pray for him, specifically as a person. Moreover, the prayer of the needy, sick, or especially holy, say monks and nuns, was viewed as especially meritorious and therefore efficacious in securing salvation for the donor. This quintessentially medieval form of memoria would have been a great novelty in Chrysostom's day, and though one cannot draw broader conclusions on how widespread this form of commemorative practice was at the time, in his description we can see a template upon which the more elaborate memorial practices of later centuries would be constructed. So at this point, I've only discussed the pro-arguments for memoria and commemoration. And yet I've described at the beginning of the talk that there was a line of critique that viewed these same practices with a rather critical eye. And we can find examples of this already in the 4th century with Epiphanius of Salamis' Panarion. And he has a character, a person in the text, Arius, who's a strict ascetic, voice the following critique of memorial practices. Quote, "Why do you mention the names of the dead after their deaths? If the living prays or is given alms, how will this benefit the dead? If the prayer of the people here has benefited the people there, no one should practice piety or perform good works. He should get some friends any way he wants, either by bribery or by asking friends on his deathbed, and they should pray that he may not suffer in the next life, or be held to account for his heinous sins." Unquote. In short, the very notion of benefiting after death from the prayer or alms of the living undercut pious living. Why would anyone take the trouble of living a virtuous life if he could simply purchase his salvation from others? This obvious point of critique would, of course, be repeated, much later. I mean, we can think of the Reformation here. It's as we see, it already makes an appearance, however, in the 4th century. Another text where we find traces of this critique of memoria is from Cyril of Jerusalem, also a 4th century author, who noted that some of his congregants criticized memorial practices and questioned whether the soul of the deceased could benefit in this way. More relevant for memoria is a tract that he supposedly wrote defending familial memorial practices of praying at tombs and celebrating the Eucharist there. However, only small excerpts of this text have been transmitted, which were themselves included in a treatise defending memorial practices in the 6th century by Eustratius of Constantinople, and we'll come to him in just a few moments. Thus, it is clear that in the first centuries of Christianity, commemorative prayer for the dead was not universally understood to be efficacious. By and large, a profound silence regarding the mourning and commemoration of the dead is discernible among the principal Greek church fathers of the 4th and early 5th century, who briefly broached the topic of memoria in their works, but by and large didn't say very much about the subject. These figures were particularly mistrustful of excessively mourning the dead, which they associated with pagan funerary practices. Death, so these authors emphasized, was for the Christian fact a blessed occurrence, release from the sorrows of earthly life. The ruminations on death of the Cappadocian Fathers and John Chrysostom, among others, however, represented only the thinking of the empire's foremost theologians, who were constrained by the relative scarcity of information on the afterlife in the scriptures. It is difficult to determine to what degree their ambivalence to the commemoration of the dead was reflected within wider society. Yet their negative attitude to memoria, or let's say neutral attitude at best, is found in other texts from the period as well. We can mainly identify criticism of memorial practices in this period, not on the basis of exponents of such doubt themselves. Critical authors in the texts they wrote have largely not survived, at least within the Greek tradition, but rather through the reaction of defenders of almsgiving and prayer for the dead. Especially noteworthy in this regard is a text authored by Eustratios of Constantinople towards the end of the 6th century. We know very little about Eustratios, other than that he was active in the capital as a priest of Hagia Sophia and was a disciple of the Patriarch Eptychios. Some traditions claim that he was a native of Melitene, or that he accompanied Eptychios during his exile in Amasia. Eustratios penned a text entitled On the Post-Mortem State of Souls, which was written as a reaction to those skeptical of whether souls were at all active after death until the Last Judgment, and whether alms and prayer could benefit the dead. The text has been interpreted, notably by Nicholas Konstas, as a defense of the cult of saints, which it certainly was, but its function as perhaps the earliest exhaustive apology for Byzantine Christian memorial practices has largely been overlooked. Given its importance for the topic of this talk, it is worth delving into its content in some detail. So the first and lengthier portion of the text is dedicated to the question of whether the soul could be active in the time between death and the Last Judgment. The shorter, and for our purposes, perhaps more relevant part of the tract concerns the efficacy of alms and prayer for the deceased. And Eustratios describes his goal for the second part of the tract as follows, and this is the citation here on the screen. Let us now come to the second query, which we promised to explore. It has been asked by some whether souls benefit from offerings and from being commemorated in prayer. Therefore, we have sought to assemble a few testimonies on this. First, to demonstrate that the ancient law, if it were somehow obscure, yet which even so serves as the basis for the law today, commands that the commemorations of the saints take place. There follows citations from various sources, including the Old and New Testament and the Greek Church Fathers. Interspersed between these citations of text are the interpretations of Eustratios himself. He begins his defense of commemorative practices and their efficacy for the souls of the dead with an apology based on the standard commemorations of the deceased, which took place on the 3rd, 9th, and 40th days after death. And he connected these with various events in the life of Christ. And he also cited this passage from 2nd Maccabees, which I showed you a few minutes ago. And as I've already mentioned, this passage from Maccabees would in fact become the strongest biblical evidence for the commemoration of the dead in later Byzantine texts. And in fact, interestingly enough, Eustratios, along with Augustine, were the first Christian authors to invoke this biblical story as evidence for the efficacy of memorial prayer and almsgiving. Proceeding chronologically, Eustratios then cites Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, presumed by Eustratios and other Byzantine authors to have been a bishop of Athens in the 1st century CE, but who was instead an anonymous philosopher and theologian who was probably active around the year 500. He also cites Ephraim the Syrian, his Testament, Cyril of Jerusalem, Cyril of Alexandria, and finally John of Chrysostom. And I would remark here that it's interesting to note that although Eustratios elsewhere in the text evidences an impressive familiarity with the works of the Cappadocian church fathers, like Basil of Caesarea, he doesn't present any citation from him, nor from any of the Cappadocian fathers more generally, to make the case for the validity of commemoration of the deceased, which I think once again demonstrates that these authors don't really talk about commemoration that much, and when they do, it's in a rather neutral fashion. So by far the strongest supporter of Memoria, cited by Eustratios, was Pseudo-Dionysius, who was, not coincidentally, also the youngest testimony cited in the work. Yet even here, Commemorative prayer was condoned in a relatively limited sense, namely only for minor or for venial sins. So if you have mortal sins or heavier sins, then these prayers don't have an effect. And this is actually an important distinction that we'll see later with Gregory the Great. So who exactly were the critics of the cult of the saints and memorial practices that moved Eustratios to compose his text in the first place? Unfortunately, he doesn't mention them by name, but we gather from the text that they were, quote, learned in speech and liked to philosophize about human souls, unquote. This was apparently criticism stemming from a philosophically inclined intellectual elite. Moreover, Eustratios' opponents seem to have been divided into two strands of thought regarding the fate of the soul after death, with one group believing that the soul disappeared at death to be reconstituted at the Last Judgment, while the other imagined that the soul entered a catatonic state in the same period, a so-called sleep of the soul. Some scholars have tried to connect these anonymous opponents of Eustratios with Stephen Gobar, a Miaphysite theologian of the mid-6th century, whose writings are known only via the summary offered in Photius' Bibliotheca. While Photius goes into great detail describing Stephen's theological arguments, including on the inactivity of the soul after death and calendrical discrepancies for the celebration of church holidays, he offers only a passing comment when Stephen discusses memorial practices. Namely, he lists basically the pros and cons of things like prayers and almsgiving in favor of the dead. So it's difficult to reconstruct exactly what arguments he used based on Photius' testimony. Let's now move to one of the main proponents of prayer for the dead and commemorative practice more generally in the Christian tradition. And that is Pope Gregory the Great, who was Pope from 590 to 604. Now, many of you who know anything about Gregory the Great, you probably think of him above all as an important figure in the Latin Christian West. However, Gregory the Great was also, one could say, the last authoritative theological voice to be equally revered across the entire Mediterranean world. In the words of James Baum, quote, Gregory the Great would be the last universal Christian author read and respected throughout Christendom, unquote. Gregory's career, in fact, reflected the later trans-Mediterranean heft of his reputation. Though firmly rooted in the monastic and spiritual traditions of his native Italy and well connected with the nascent Christian kingdoms of the early medieval West, before his papacy, he had served as the Holy See's representative, the Apokrisarios, at the imperial court in Constantinople. Among theologians who wrote in Latin, Gregory is unique both in that he was widely respected in the Byzantine world and that his works were translated into Greek, and at a relatively early date. So already around 602, his Regula Pastoris was rendered into Greek by Anastasius, Patriarch of Antioch, although the Greek version of this work is now lost, while his dialogues were translated by the last so-called Greek pope, Zacharias, in the middle of the 8th century. According to Photius, again, from the Bibliotheca, Zacharias also translated other texts of Gregory, perhaps his letters, we don't know, whose Greek versions have not been transmitted. So with Gregory, we see here a powerful and dramatic new emphasis on the efficacy of commemorative prayer and masses for the dead, which more or less canonized its use in the Latin West and much later was cited to the same effect in the Byzantine East. And the main text upon which this was based was his dialogues. Now, the content of the dialogues concerning the efficacy of prayers and masses for the dead is well known, but I will nonetheless here give a few examples. For instance, asked whether burial in a church was of any benefit to the soul, Gregory replied that as long as the injured person was free of mortal sin, here we see again this distinction between venial sin and mortal sin, about whether a person can benefit post-mortem from various good practices, then church burial was indeed beneficial, and that their relatives would come, see their tombs, and pray to God for their souls. In another section, Gregory recounts that a priest in the see of Centrum Celis would customarily go to a hot spring to bathe, and at one point a man began to appear at that spot to assist and attend the priest. After this had occurred many times, the priest decided to bring the man 2 unconsecrated hosts as a reward. The man was taken aback and revealed to the priest that he had once been the master of the hot springs, but was now condemned to do service in the same place for his sins. He beseeched the priest to instead offer the host on his behalf, so that he might be freed from his punishment. Crestfallen, the priest departed and offered the Eucharist daily for 7 days for the man, and upon coming to the springs once again, did not find him there, indicated that he had been redeemed from his post-mortal punishment. Gregory concludes that this anecdote emphatically demonstrates the power of the offering the divine host for the deceased by the living, and how the souls of the former are ransomed by its power. In the same chapter of the Dialogues, Gregory tells another story about a monk named Eustace, who had come from his own monastery, and who had hidden a treasure of 3 crowns, which of course as a monk you're not supposed to have personal property. This is a major sin. Confessing this on his deathbed, Gregory forbade that the monks comfort Eustace and denied him burial among his brothers. 30 days after Eustace's death, feeling anguish at the terrible punishment he must have been suffering, Gregory relented and asked the abbot of the monastery to offer the divine sacrifice on his behalf for 30 days in a row. On the 30th day, the deceased Eustace appeared to a brother, and upon being asked how he was faring, stated that though he had previously been in a bad way, he was now well because he had received communion. And I could multiply these tales. I mean, there are many, many examples from the Dialogues alone about communion, the Eucharist, almsgiving, or prayer having a positive effect on people who are already deceased. And tales such as these demonstrate Pope Gregory's confidence in the efficacy of Masses and prayer for the dead, which corresponded to his belief in an immediate judgment after death and the cleansing power of purgatory, at least for venial sense, or it's, purgatory is sort of an unclear idea at this point, but what would later become purgatory. In this respect, he further elaborated the post-mortal conception of the Church Father Augustine, who thought that offerings at the altar and alms would benefit the not entirely bad, the non valde mali. In summation, in Gregory's Dialogues, those who championed commemorative practices acquired a full-throated proponent whose authority was broadly recognized within the Byzantine tradition. Thus, around the year 600, both proponents and opponents of commemorative practice had already made their case in some detail, which set the stage for the further development of this debate over the course of the politically tumultuous period of the next few centuries, which included both the Arab-Islamic conquest of the 7th century and the iconoclast controversy of the 8th and 9th centuries. Unfortunately, due to the constraints of time, I will mostly skip over developments concerning prayer for the dead in this period. Though one might be tempted to neatly assign opponents and proponents of memorial prayer and almsgiving to the iconoclasts and iconodules respectively, it seems that within the iconodule party there existed a rigorous position which called into question the efficacy of post-mortal benefactions made on behalf of the deceased. This line of thought was advanced within the iconophile camp by the abbot Niketas of Medicia, as reported in his Vita. Quote, "Let us fight as long as we have time, and let us not become lax through negligence. Let us multiply the profit of the soul as long as the fair is open, because once it is closed, nobody does business." He says, "In death, there is nobody who remembers you. In the underworld, there is no confession." Unquote. So very clearly, if you do behave well in your life, because there's no chance to redeem yourself once you've passed on. So even though he was later celebrated as a champion of the veneration of icons under the second iconoclasm, in his attitude to commemoration, Niketas was thus a traditionalist, rigorous, whose views reflected those, more or less, of the Cappadocian and Desert Fathers. Thus, we see that in the 9th century, this line of critique of memorial practice continued to exist. It hadn't disappeared. And with that, we now come to a figure that probably many of you have not heard of, because I don't think he's that well known, maybe outside of Byzantine studies. And that is not John of Damascus, but a pseudo-John of Damascus, who's the author of a text that's entitled "On Those Who Have Fallen Asleep in the Faith." And for a tract that played such a pivotal role in the development of Byzantine memoria, and I'll explain in a few moments why that is, "On Those Who Have Fallen Asleep in the Faith" is a tract whose origins which can only be painted with the broadest of brushes. Though it is ascribed to John of Damascus, who died in the year 749, scholarship rejects this attribution and argues for a later date of composition, perhaps in the first half of the 9th century or middle of the 9th century, we don't know. Hypotheses regarding the tract's author, if John of Damascus can indeed be excluded, are varied and are really just guesses. The author begins the tract by noting that there are those who question the efficacy of benefactions performed for the deceased. In fact, this doubt had been sown by Satan himself. In order to refute these errors, the text author presents a series of citations in chronological order, which purport to demonstrate the potency and validity of post-mortal prayer and almsgiving. He begins, of course, and we might expect this at this point, with the story from 2 Maccabees, which, as noted earlier, would become the most offside biblical justification for the commemoration of the dead in Byzantium. He then refers to the apostolic constitutions, which we've also seen. Then he moves on to Dionysius the Areopagite, and actually slightly reworks his material so that this distinction between post-mortal prayers and benefactions that can wipe away venial sins but can't wipe away mortal sins is somewhat dissipated, let's say, or weakened. Then he moves on to the Cappadocian Father Gregory of Nyssa, and he presents some quotations from his funeral oration. Again, these are relatively neutral and perhaps slightly positive discussions of memorial practice. But then we get, I think, to the really interesting and innovative examples in the text. And the first one comes from a text that deals with the Christian martyr Thecla, who was her legend is first recorded in an apocryphal 2nd century Acts of Paul. And as the story goes, after her conversion to Christianity, Thecla was twice imprisoned. And during her second imprisonment, she was handed over at her own request to house arrest to the care of a certain Tryphena, apparently to avoid being raped while in prison. And during this period, Tryphena beseeched Thecla to intercede for the salvation of her deceased daughter, one Falconilla. And Thecla's legend became the subject of an elaborate reworking in the 5th century, in which her prayer for Falconilla reads as follows, and this is what's cited in this tract by Pseudo John of Damascus. And again, I will read out this quotation. Christ, King of the heavens, child of the great and most high Father, who has bestowed grace upon me such that I believe in you and am saved, and who has made the light of your truth shine before me, and who has already deemed me worthy that I might suffer for you, grant also to your servant Tryphena the fulfillment of her wish concerning her daughter. Her wish is that the soul of her daughter be numbered among the souls who have already believed in you, and so that she enjoy dwelling in luxury in paradise. Make this reward payment to Tryphena and to me, Master Christ, for behold, as you see, she has become the guardian of my virginity, has stood beside me, in addition to your own Paul, and she has snatched me from the fury of Alexander, and she has comforted me on her breast in her home after my tear with the beast. Although she is a queen, she has been reduced to my debased level out of desire and fear towards you. In exchange for all these things, she desires and requests this, that her only and beloved child obtain some rest. And here we come to the key distinction of this between this passage and earlier passages we've seen, which is namely that the post-mortal redemption of Falconilla, who according to John of Damascus was, quote, a pagan, an idolatress, and a servant of an unholy and strange master, so she's not a Christian. This is something that's new for proponents of Memoria, namely the idea that commemorative prayer can redeem not only the faithful, not only Christians, but people who aren't even Christian, if God so wills it. And this is actually not the only such example in this text, because we have another citation, and this one might at first glance to us seem even more bizarre. And this concerns Gregory the Great, Gregory the Dialogist, and the Emperor Trajan, Roman Emperor Trajan of all people. And this comes from the life of Gregory the Great, and again, I will read this text. Gregory the Dialogist, the Bishop of Old Rome, as everybody knows, was a man well known for his righteousness and knowledge. They even say that the divine angel assisted him when he was conducting the liturgy. One day, this Gregory, while taking a walk on a paved road, stood with purpose and uttered a mighty prayer directed towards the soul-giving Lord for the forgiveness of the sins of Trajan the emperor, Immediately after saying these things, he heard a voice borne to him from God. Quote, I have heard your prayer, and I grant forgiveness to Trajan. But you should not again put forward prayers addressed to me on behalf of pagans. Unquote. And that the story is true and blameless, the whole of East and West is witness. Look, this even surpasses what happened to Falconilla. For she was a party to no other evil beyond idolatry. But Trajan brought about the deaths of many martyrs. You are marvelous, Lord, and marvelous are your works. We praise your incredible goodness of heart, because you always incline toward the love of human beings. So this remarkable story of Pope Gregory's prayer for the Emperor Trajan, which in fact contradicted Gregory's own teachings regarding the efficacy of praying for the dead, since in his view only Christians could benefit from such intercessions, as noted by some medieval commentators of the story, belongs to a larger tradition of medieval texts in the Latin West and Byzantine East that recounted this legend. While the passage cited in full constitutes the first mention of the legend in the Byzantine tradition, a similar version of the story was recounted all the way to the north and to the west in Whitby in England at around the same time, between 704 and 714. So though separated by vast geographic distances and written in different languages and cultural contexts, this legend about Gregory the Great and his prayer for the Emperor Trajan apparently belonged to a common stock of anecdotes about this venerable pope. So with these two stories about the post-mortal salvation of Falconilla and Emperor Trajan, Pseudo-John of Damascus created the groundwork for what would become an oft-cited trio of miraculous redemptions in the Byzantine tradition. The third figure in this triad is the Emperor Theophilus, an iconoclast emperor who reigned from 829 to 842, and is fundamentally different from that of Falconilla and Trajan, because although he was not a pagan, he was considered a heretic, and a particularly bad one at that. And it was only via an elaborately organized effort at posthumous redemption that was directed by his widow, Theodora, that he was saved from a heretic's fate. So together, these three figures, so Falconilla, the Emperor Trajan, and Theophilus, would be cited as a triad of examples that undergird this idea that even non-Christians and heretics could be saved after death. Though exceptional cases, they provided important loopholes, you might say, for the redemption of mortal sinners. To call on those who have fallen asleep in the faith a Byzantine bestseller would be a wild understatement. According to a Pinaque search, the treatise is transmitted in 164 manuscripts, which, by the way, for Byzantine texts is a huge number. The fact that the text gains such popularity both speaks to the need to justify commemorative practices and perhaps continuing skepticism in some circles regarding those same practices. Indeed, treatises written in defense of the commemoration of the dead continued to be written into the 11th and 12th centuries, as evidenced by two such texts that were recently edited by Dirk Cross-Müller. In any case, by the end of the 9th century, essentially all the major texts that were used by later authors to justify memorial practices for the dead had been written. By the 11th century, in the Byzantine tradition, we suddenly have much more evidence for the popularity of memoria than in previous centuries, in many spheres. For one, in documents associated with Byzantine monasticism, and especially founders' charters, or so-called typica, the special commemoration of the dead, hitherto practically unmentioned, is all of a sudden a major topic of concern and discussed at great length. For instance, in Gregory Pacurianos' Typicon for his monastery at Vachkepol. Elites like Pacurianos now often built tombs within monasteries, in which they sought to be specially memorialized for the rest of eternity. Also from this period appear the first special commemorative lists, including this book of commemorations, this Georgian book of commemorations from Avira Monastery at Mount Athos. So we have this flowering of evidence for memoria in the 11th century. And on the other hand, the traces of the critique of memorial practice found in earlier periods practically disappears. And probably by the 11th century, at the latest, the pro-memoria party had won this debate about the efficacy of prayer and benefactions for the dead. In closing my paper, I would like to briefly return to this idea of the invention of prayer for the dead in Byzantium that I evoked in the title for my talk. As I've tried to show over the course of the last 15 minutes, in the primitive church, and indeed well into late antiquity, the widespread acceptance of the commemoration of the dead in the Byzantine tradition was by no means assured. In order to justify memorial practice, not only theologians and thinkers had to carefully comb through the canon of accepted texts for favorable opinions of Memoria. Since Scripture offered so little in this regard, the second Maccabees episode being mentioned in this talk being the one exception, the key voices who spoke in support of commemoration were of a later chronological vintage. As we have seen, the main such figures were Gregory the Great and Pseudo-John of Damascus. With this quote-unquote invention of commemorative prayer that occurred, I wanted to imply not so much the creating of something out of nothing, but rather the finding of something that was already there, even if it was obscured from view. I would like to thank you for your patience, and I look forward to the discussion.